The heat was unbearable. The sun, high in the cloudless sky, scorched the earth and reflected off the endless waves of sand. Each step felt like dragging through molten rock, and the weight of their armor seemed to grow heavier with every hour. Marcus, Robert, and Thomas had been wandering through the desert for what felt like days. Their water skins were nearly empty, their horses long abandoned after they collapsed from exhaustion. They were alone now, lost, with no signs of the rest of their Crusader army. "We'll find them soon," Marcus said, though his voice carried no real hope. He was the oldest of the three, a knight who had fought in countless battles. His once shining armor was now caked with dust and sand. He wiped his brow, squinting into the horizon, where nothing but sand dunes stretched out as far as the eye could see. Robert, walking a few paces behind him, grunted in response. His mouth was dry, his throat raw from thirst. "If the heat doesn't kill us, the Saracens will," he muttered. Robert, while younger than Marcus, had fought bravely in the Holy Land, though his patience was thinning. Thomas, the youngest of the group, a mere squire who had yet to see real battle, followed closely. His face was pale, his lips cracked. He clung to his sword, though he had no idea what he would do if they were attacked. The sun beat down on them, merciless and unrelenting. Every step forward felt like a step closer to death. "We're not far from the river," Marcus said, though none of them had seen water for days. He tried to stay positive for Thomas's sake, but even his optimism was wearing thin. He glanced at the squire, who was struggling to keep up. "Keep moving, Thomas. You'll be fine." "Just focus on getting to the next dune," Marcus urged, his voice a bit softer. Suddenly, Robert stopped, narrowing his eyes toward the horizon. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice tense. Marcus followed Robert's gaze and saw something moving in the distance. A cloud of dust, rising quickly, growing larger. Figures, moving fast. Riders? They couldn't be sure. Marcus immediately reached for his sword, pulling it from its scabbard. "Prepare yourselves," he said, his voice low and firm. "We might have company." Thomas fumbled with his sword, his hands shaking, as the three of them stood on the edge of a sand dune. The figures grew closer, their shapes becoming more distinct. Men, running on foot, cloaked in loose robes, their heads covered from the sun. Muslim warriors. "There's at least 10 of them," Robert said, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Do we fight?" Marcus hesitated, watching the approaching figures. Something wasn't right. The warriors weren't advancing in a formation. They weren't coming toward the Crusaders as if for battle. They were running, fleeing. "Wait," Marcus said, holding up a hand to stop Robert. "Look at them. They're not coming for us?" The three stood their ground as the group of Muslim warriors approached at a frantic pace. The men's faces were twisted with fear, their breasts ragged as they charged up the dune. They didn't even seem to notice the Crusaders standing there, their eyes wild, darting behind them as if something unseen was chasing them. "What the hell?" Robert muttered, lowering his sword, confused. One of the Muslim warriors, clearly their leader, finally noticed the Crusaders standing in their path. He stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal the others. For a moment, it seemed like there would be a standoff, both sides eyeing each other with suspicion and uncertainty. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself between Robert and Thomas and the approaching group. The leader of the Muslim warriors spoke quickly in his language, his voice urgent, but none of the Crusaders could understand him. His tone wasn't threatening. It was fearful, desperate. "What is he saying?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Marcus replied, but he could see it in the man's eyes. Whatever they were running from, it wasn't the Crusaders. The leader of the Muslims pointed behind them, toward the horizon from which they had come. He repeated a single word over and over, his voice thick with terror. Marcus didn't need to understand the language to recognize fear. He knew that look well. from battle, from men who had seen death too many times. This wasn't the face of a man running from an enemy army. This was something far worse. And then they heard it. A sound, distant at first, but growing louder. A low, guttural howl that carried on the wind, echoing across the desert like the wail of a dying animal. It was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. The sound cut through the air, making their skin crawl. Robert stepped back, gripping his sword tighter. What in God's name is that? The Muslim leader began shouting again, pointing furiously behind them as the other warriors backed away, their eyes wide with terror. Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. "We need to move," Marcus said, his voice tense. "Whatever that is, it's coming this way." The howl grew louder, closer, as if the very desert itself was alive and hunting them. The Muslim warriors didn't wait. They turned and continued running, their leader glancing back at Marcus with one final, pleading look before following his men. "We should follow them," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper, his body shaking. Marcus didn't argue. "Run." And they did. The 3 Crusaders, lost and desperate, ran after the fleeing Muslim warriors, the sound of the thing pursuing them growing ever closer. Whatever was hunting them across the sands wasn't human. And as the night began to fall, Marcus knew they were running from something far worse than death. They ran. Sand kicked up around their feet as they raced over the dunes, every step dragging them deeper into exhaustion. The air grew colder as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting an eerie blue light over the desert. The distant howl had quieted, but the sense of impending doom hadn't lifted. Marcus's lungs burned, but he pushed forward, following the Muslim warriors who ran like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Robert gasped for breath, glancing back, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is chasing us, Marcus?" "I don't know." Marcus snapped, not slowing down. "But we're not sticking around to find out." Thomas struggled to keep up, his legs trembling, his armor weighing him down. He stumbled over a rock, nearly falling, but Marcus grabbed him by the arm, pulling him upright. "Stay on your feet, Squire. Don't fall behind." The leader of the Muslim warriors shouted something in his language, pointing toward the horizon. They were heading for a jagged rock formation that jutted out from the desert like a cluster of broken teeth. The warriors veered toward it, and Marcus followed without question. As they neared the rocks, one of the Muslim warriors tripped and fell face first into the sand. The others didn't stop. His screams echoed through the night as he struggled to get back up, but something dark, a shadow, moving impossibly fast, swept over him. Marcus caught a glimpse of it, just for a moment. A shape, a form, like smoke but solid, twisting and writhing, with glowing eyes that burned like coals. It moved through the air with unnatural speed, covering the fallen man in an instant. The man's scream stopped abruptly, cut off by a sickening crack. "Run faster!" Marcus shouted, his heart pounding in his chest as they reached the rocks. The Muslim warriors scrambled up the steep slope, Marcus and Robert close behind, dragging Thomas with them. As they reached the top, the leader of the Muslim warriors finally stopped, gasping for breath, his eyes wide and wild. Marcus collapsed against the rock, breathing heavily, his hand still gripping Thomas's arm to steady him. "What was that?" Robert panted, looking at the Muslim leader. The leader shook his head, clearly struggling to find the words. He pointed behind them, toward the desert, and said something in his language. When Marcus didn't respond, the leader slammed his hand against his chest, then pointed back to the sand. "Djinn," the Muslim warrior finally said, his voice thick with fear. "Djinn." Marcus's blood ran cold. He had heard the word before. Legends, tales told around campfires. Djinn were ancient spirits, creatures of fire and smoke, born of the desert. They were said to be able to change shape, to control the elements, to possess men's bodies. But those were just stories, weren't they? Impossible, Robert whispered. Djinn are myths. Ghost stories. The Muslim leader shook his head fiercely. Not myths, real. We found tomb, ancient, disturbed it. His broken speech was filled with panic. We released it. What do you mean, you released it? Marcus asked, his eyes narrowing. You brought this thing to life? The man nodded slowly. Tomb, cursed. It hunts us now, kills. Before Marcus could respond, another howl echoed through the desert. This one closer. Too close. The Djinn was coming. We can't stay here, Robert said, backing away from the edge of the rock. It's going to find us. We're sitting ducks up here. The Muslim leader muttered something under his breath, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed toward the desert again, shaking his head. Marcus gripped his sword tighter. No, we stand and fight. We've got no choice. The Muslim leader gave a sharp, frightened laugh. Fight? No fight, no sword, no shield. Cannot be killed. Marcus felt a knot of fear tighten in his chest. Then what do we do? We die, the Muslim leader said, his voice hollow. Before anyone could react, the shadow appeared again, sliding across the sand toward them. The Djinn moved faster than any man, its body flickering like flames in the wind. It seemed to blur, shifting from solid to smoke, wrapping itself around the rocks like a living mist. Get back, Marcus yelled, raising his sword. The Djinn struck. It moved through the air like lightning, its form splitting into several pieces before reforming behind one of the Muslim warriors. The warrior barely had time to scream before the Djinn wrapped around him, its smoky tendrils digging into his skin, burning him alive from the inside out. The man's body twisted unnaturally, his bones snapping as the Djinn consumed him. The remaining warriors and Crusaders backed up, horror etched on their faces. Run! Marcus shouted again, pushing Thomas toward the opposite side of the rock. Now! The group stumbled down the far slope of the rocks, racing through the sand as the Djinn followed, its form shifting and swirling like a storm of smoke and fire. Robert swung his sword blindly at the creature, but his blade passed through it like air. The Djinn howled in response, its voice like the wail of 1,000 souls. There's no stopping it. Robert cried out, terror in his voice. We keep moving, Marcus barked. Get to cover. Thomas tripped again, his foot catching on a jagged rock hidden in the sand. He cried out as he fell, but before Marcus could reach him, the Djinn was there. It hovered over the squire, its eyes glowing brighter as if considering its next move. For a split second, Thomas's eyes met Marcus's. Fear filled the boy's face, but the Djinn didn't kill him. Instead, it paused. Slowly, the Djinn's form seemed to wrap around Thomas, but it didn't strike. Its smoky tendrils hovered just above the boy's skin. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the Djinn disappeared into the night, leaving Thomas trembling in the sand, alive but shaken. Marcus ran to him, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. Are you all right? Thomas nodded, but his eyes were distant, glazed over, as if in shock. I think so. Behind them, the Djinn's howl echoed again, further away this time, but still close enough to chill them all to the bone. We can't keep running, Marcus said through gritted teeth. We need a plan. The Muslim leader stared at them, his face pale. Plan? There is no plan. We are doomed. They kept moving, stumbling over the uneven desert, the horizon darker now as night fully set in. The stars offered little light, and the wind carried a faint, eerie whisper that seemed to come from all directions. The Djinn was somewhere behind them, lurking, watching. Every shadow felt alive, every gust of wind like the creature's breath. We can't keep running, Robert said, breathless. That thing is toying with us. It's only a matter of time. Marcus pushed forward, eyes scanning the desert. There has to be something. Somewhere we can take shelter. The Muslim leader, lagging behind, shouted something and pointed ahead. Just barely visible against the black horizon was a jagged structure. A ruin of stone, half buried by sand, as if it had been forgotten by time. There, Marcus urged. Head for the ruins. With renewed energy, the group stumbled toward the ancient structure. The walls were cracked and weathered, the stone crumbling in places, but the ruin was still standing, a fortress from a long-dead empire. The moment they stepped inside, the air grew cooler, a faint smell of damp earth replacing the suffocating heat of the desert. "We'll be safe here, right?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned against the stone, his skin pale, eyes sunken. The Muslim leader ran his hand over the walls, muttering prayers in Arabic. His fingers traced faint symbols etched into the stone, worn, but still visible. "These are wards," the leader said. "Ancient protection. Djinn cannot enter." "Good," Robert muttered, collapsing against the stone, his body drenched in sweat. "Maybe we have a chance now." But Marcus wasn't so sure. He watched as Thomas slumped down next to Robert, staring blankly into space, his hands shaking. Something was off. The boy hadn't been the same since the Djinn spared him. His usually talkative nature had been replaced by an eerie silence. "Thomas," Marcus said, stepping closer. "You all right?" Thomas blinked up at him, as if snapping out of a daze. I don't know. I feel strange." Marcus crouched beside him. "Strange how?" Thomas's eyes seemed unfocused, distant. "It's hard to explain. It's like there's something in my head. A voice, whispering things. I don't understand what it's saying." Robert, overhearing the conversation, looked over, concern creasing his brow. "What do you mean, whispering?" "You're just in shock, lad. You'll be fine." Thomas shook his head, his voice growing quieter. No, it's something else. I can hear it, like a memory that isn't mine. It's ancient." Marcus exchanged a worried glance with Robert. "Rest for now," he said, trying to sound reassuring, but his mind was racing. Whatever happened when the Djinn surrounded Thomas, it wasn't good. The Muslim leader sat down beside them, pulling out a flask of water. He took a small sip, then offered it to Marcus. "Wards will hold, but not forever." Marcus frowned, taking the flask and drinking deeply. "What do you mean?" "These wards. They are old, fading." The leader looked around the ruin, his eyes tracing the cracks in the stone. "Djinn, powerful. It will wait. It knows we have no other choice. It will wear the wards down. Eventually, it will come." A cold dread settled over Marcus. They had found temporary safety, but the Djinn was patient. It had eternity. They did not. Robert stood, pacing nervously. "So, what do we do? Just sit here and wait to die?" Marcus gritted his teeth, staring at the walls, searching for any solution. "We prepare. We can't outrun it, and we can't fight it in the open. But maybe we can trap it." "Trap it?" Robert looked at him like he was mad. "The wards are still holding," Marcus continued, "but the creature can't come in. If we find a way to strengthen them, we might be able to hold the Djinn long enough to make a run for it." The Muslim leader shook his head. "Impossible. We do not know the magic. Then what are we supposed to do?" Robert snapped, his frustration boiling over. "There's no way out of this." As the tension in the room rose, Thomas's body suddenly tensed. His hands twitched, and his eyes glazed over again, staring at nothing. His lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as if he were somewhere else entirely. "Thomas?" Marcus reached out, shaking the boy's shoulder. "Thomas, talk to me." But the squire didn't respond. Instead, his mouth opened, and a low, guttural whisper escaped. The voice was not his own. It spoke in a language none of them could understand, the words ancient, chilling. The sound of it made the hair on Marcus's neck stand on end. The Muslim leader immediately backed away, his face pale with fear. "Djinn," he whispered, pointing at Thomas. "It has him." Thomas blinked, his eyes refocusing, and he looked around, confused. What? What happened? Marcus grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him gently. "You're not all right, Thomas. The Djinn, whatever it is, it's inside you." "No." Thomas shook his head violently, trying to deny it. "No, I'm fine. I swear." But Marcus knew better. He had seen men possessed by fear, but this was something else. The Djinn wasn't just terrorizing them from the outside. It was inside Thomas, creeping into his mind. Robert stepped forward, drawing his sword. "We need to do something. We can't just let it take him." "No," Thomas cried, backing away. "I'm fine. I'm still me." But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the Djinn was using the boy, and it was only a matter of time before it took full control. "We need to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here." The Muslim leader shook his head. "We leave the wards, we die." Marcus looked at Thomas, who was shaking, his eyes flickering with some unseen struggle. They didn't have a choice. If they stayed, the Djinn would break through the wards. If they left, they'd be at its mercy. But staying meant giving the Djinn more time to fully take Thomas. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We'll move at first light. For now, we rest." Robert didn't argue, though his expression was grim. The Muslim leader muttered a prayer under his breath, backing into the shadows of the ruin. Marcus sat next to Thomas, keeping a close eye on him as the boy's breathing steadied. But even as Thomas closed his eyes, Marcus knew the truth. The Djinn wasn't just outside waiting. It was already among them, inside their friend. And time was running out. Night had fully claimed the desert, and with it came an eerie silence. The wind had died, and the only sounds were the faint, shallow breaths of the survivors huddled within the ancient ruins. The sky, once clear, was now covered with dark clouds, blocking the moonlight. The temperature had dropped, but no one dared light a fire. Heat or no heat, none of them wanted to draw attention. Marcus sat against the cracked stone wall, eyes fixed on Thomas, who slept fitfully. The boy twitched, mumbled to himself, his face glistening with sweat. Marcus hadn't slept. He couldn't. Not with the Djinn lurking just outside, and certainly not with the growing fear that Thomas wasn't fully himself anymore. Robert paced restlessly, his sword drawn, eyes darting to every shadow that moved. "We can't just sit here waiting to die, Marcus." Marcus didn't respond. His mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. They were trapped. The Djinn was toying with them, waiting for its moment to strike. But something told him it wasn't just waiting to get past the wards. It was biding its time, letting its influence over Thomas fester. Suddenly, the air shifted. Marcus felt it. Like the temperature dropped even further, but it wasn't just cold. It was as though the desert itself had stopped breathing. A faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind, filled the air. But there was no wind. Robert stopped pacing, his grip tightening on his sword. "Do you hear that?" The Muslim leader's eyes widened. "It comes." A deep, low howl echoed across the dunes, louder and more menacing than before. Marcus's heart leaped into his throat. The Djinn was here. The Muslim leader hurried to the edge of the ruins, his hands trembling as he muttered prayers in rapid succession. His fingers brushed over the worn symbols carved into the stone walls, his lips moving faster, more desperate. "What's happening?" Robert demanded. "The wards." "Failing," the leader gasped, his voice strained. "It is coming." A gust of wind, impossibly cold, blew through the ruins, snuffing out their last bit of warmth. The Djinn's presence pressed down on them, a weight that squeezed their chests and made their hearts pound. The shadows around them seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive. And then it appeared. The Djinn's form, a swirling mass of smoke and fire, slid through the cracks in the stone. Its glowing red eyes burned in the darkness, fixed on the group like a predator sizing up its prey. It slithered through the air, moving between solid and ethereal, its body shifting, distorting the space around it. Robert raised his sword, his hand shaking. "We can't let it inside." "It's too late," Marcus muttered, his eyes narrowing as the Djinn moved closer. He grabbed his sword and stepped forward. "We fight." The Djinn let out a guttural snarl, a sound that reverberated through the air and shook the very ground beneath them. It moved faster than any of them expected, shooting forward like a bolt of lightning. Robert swung his sword wildly, but the blade passed through the Djinn's smoky form, harmlessly slicing through air. "Damn it," Robert cursed, swinging again, but to no avail. The Djinn retaliated, its body flickering as it shifted, lashing out with tendrils of black smoke. One of the Muslim warriors screamed as the tendrils wrapped around his throat, lifting him off the ground. His body convulsed as the smoke seemed to burrow into his skin. His face contorted in agony before his body went limp, lifeless. The Djinn tossed him aside like a rag doll. "We can't fight this thing," Robert shouted, panic rising in his voice. "We need to run." "There's nowhere to go," Marcus growled, his eyes scanning the ruins for any way to hold off the Djinn. But the wards were crumbling, and the creature was inside. It was only a matter of time. Thomas, who had been eerily silent, suddenly stood. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, and his eyes. Marcus noticed it immediately. His eyes were glazed over, a faint flicker of red in their depths. "Thomas?" Marcus called out, stepping toward him. "Thomas, what are you doing?" But Thomas didn't respond. His head twitched to the side, as if listening to something only he could hear. Slowly he turned to face the Djinn. And then, to Marcus's horror, Thomas began to walk toward the creature. "Thomas, no!" Marcus lunged forward, grabbing his arm, pulling him back. "Stay away from it!" The Djinn paused, its fiery eyes fixed on the boy. For a moment, the creature seemed interested. It didn't attack. Instead, it hovered there, watching, waiting. Robert's eyes widened. "It's inside him." Marcus tightened his grip on Thomas, shaking him. "Thomas, fight it!" "Don't let it take you." But Thomas didn't respond. His body was stiff, his eyes vacant. And then he spoke, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "He's already mine," the voice hissed, cold and inhuman. It was the Djinn's voice, speaking through the squire. Marcus recoiled, his heart pounding. "No." Thomas's lips curled into a twisted smile, his body jerking in unnatural movements. "Your efforts are pointless, knight. I cannot be killed. I cannot be stopped. You will all die here." The Djinn flickered, its form shifting as it hovered closer. Robert raised his sword again, his face twisted with desperation. "Get out of him, you monster." But the Djinn only laughed, a dark, menacing sound that echoed through the ruins. "You are already lost." Before Robert could strike, Thomas moved, faster than any human should. His arm shot out, grabbing Robert by the wrist with a strength that wasn't his own. Robert gasped in shock, his sword clattering to the ground as Thomas's grip tightened. "Thomas, stop!" Marcus shouted, rushing forward, but he was too late. With a sickening snap, Thomas twisted Robert's wrist, breaking the bone. Robert screamed in pain, falling to his knees as Thomas, no, the Djinn, looked down at him with cold, unfeeling eyes. The Muslim leader shouted a prayer, throwing himself at the Djinn's smoky form, but the creature swatted him aside with a flick of its tendrils, sending him crashing into the stone wall. Marcus stood frozen, torn between saving his friend and fighting the creature. But it was no use. The Djinn was everywhere. It was inside Thomas, and it was winning. The ground trembled, and the ancient walls of the ruins began to crack. The Djinn's form expanded, filling the space, its voice booming in the air. There is no escape. In a final, desperate act, Marcus raised his sword, his eyes locked on Thomas. "I'm sorry," he whispered, before charging forward. But the Djinn was faster. Before Marcus could strike, the creature lashed out, its smoky tendrils wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. He struggled, but it was no use. The Djinn's grip was too strong. Thomas, or what was left of him, stared down at Marcus, a cruel smile playing on his lips. This is only the beginning. Marcus could barely breathe. The Djinn's tendrils tightened around his legs, pulling him deeper into the sand, while Thomas, his young squire, now twisted by the Djinn's malevolent power, stood over him with a vacant, cruel expression. The fire in the boy's eyes burned with the Djinn's presence, a cold, inhuman flicker that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. He had to act fast. With a sudden burst of strength, Marcus twisted his body, slashing at the smoky tendrils that held him. His sword passed through the Djinn's form, doing nothing to hurt the creature, but it was enough to loosen its grip. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his eyes locked on Thomas, hoping, praying, that there was still a shred of the boy left inside. "Thomas, you have to fight it," Marcus shouted, desperation thick in his voice. Thomas blinked slowly, his head tilting to the side in a disturbingly unnatural way. The Djinn's voice, cold and mocking, came from the boy's lips. "Fight? There is no fight. He is mine." Robert, cradling his broken wrist, staggered to his feet behind Marcus, his face twisted in agony but determined. "We have to get him out of here. Maybe if we—" The Djinn cut him off, laughing. "You think you can save him? You are too late." Without warning, Thomas lunged forward, moving with unnatural speed and precision. His hand shot out, grabbing Robert by the throat and slamming him against the crumbling stone wall. Robert gasped, his free hand clawing at Thomas's grip, but the boy's strength, no, the Djinn's strength, was too much. "Thomas!" Marcus yelled, rushing forward, but the Djinn swatted him aside with a flick of its smoky tendrils, sending him sprawling across the sand. Robert's face turned red as he struggled to breathe, his eyes wide with panic. The Djinn inside Thomas smiled cruelly, its grip tightening. "He's already dead," the creature hissed. Marcus, his heart pounding, forced himself to his feet. He couldn't let this happen, not like this. But how could he fight the Djinn when it was inside Thomas? How could he strike down the boy he had sworn to protect? The Muslim leader, still slumped against the wall from his earlier injuries, groaned in pain as he pushed himself up, muttering prayers under his breath. His eyes were filled with fear, but also determination. "There is one way," he gasped, looking at Marcus. "You must sever the connection." Marcus's eyes flicked between Thomas and the leader. "How?" The leader gripped his side, his face pale. "The Djinn feeds on the soul. It must take the body fully before it can kill. If you strike now, you might stop it, but only if you act now." Marcus's blood ran cold. He knew what the leader was asking. He would have to kill Thomas to stop the Djinn. The boy was lost. If he hesitated, they were all dead. Robert's struggles weakened as the Djinn's grip tightened around his throat. His face was turning a sickly shade of blue. There was no time left. "Do it." Robert gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the only way." Marcus's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword. His vision blurred with tears, his mind racing. This was the boy he had watched grow from a clumsy squire into a brave young man. ECOULDN, single quotes, T. He shouldn't have to make this choice. But there was no other option. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. With a sudden, decisive movement, Marcus raised his sword and charged forward. The Djinn, still controlling Thomas's body, turned to face him, a flash of surprise crossing its burning eyes. For a moment, just a brief second, Marcus thought he saw Thomas's face, his real face, emerge from behind the Djinn's shadow. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, his lips parting as if to speak. But it was too late. With a single swift stroke, Marcus's sword pierced through Thomas's chest. The boy gasped, his body convulsing as the blade sank deep into his flesh. For a moment the air was filled with an unnatural silence, broken only by the faint crackling of the Djinn's smoky form flickering around them. The Djinn let out a howl of rage, its form twisting and writhing as it was forced out of Thomas's body. The creature's smoky tendrils thrashed wildly, tearing through the air as it shrieked in pain. The fire in Thomas's eyes flickered and died. Thomas crumpled to the ground, his eyes wide, his body limp. The Djinn's form twisted into a swirling mass of smoke, its fiery eyes narrowing as it floated above them. Furious but weakened. "You think this changes anything?" It hissed, its voice seething with anger. "I will consume you all." Marcus stood over Thomas's body, his hands shaking, tears streaming down his face. He had done it. He had saved them. But the price was too high. Robert collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as he clutched his throat. We have to get out of here," he choked out. But Marcus couldn't move. He stared down at Thomas's lifeless form, his heart heavy with grief. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The Djinn, still writhing above them, laughed coldly. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. This desert is mine." The ground beneath them trembled, cracks splitting through the ancient stone as the ruins began to collapse. Marcus staggered back, his mind spinning. The Djinn was still here, still too strong, and now it was angry. "Move!" Robert shouted, grabbing Marcus by the arm and pulling him toward the exit. The Muslim leader, still injured but determined, hobbled after them, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The walls of the ruins began to cave in as the Djinn's form swirled higher, expanding, feeding off the darkness around it. The creature let out another furious howl, its voice echoing through the night as the stones crumbled. Marcus, Robert, and the Muslim leader barely made it outside as the ruins collapsed behind them, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. The ground continued to shake, the desert itself seeming to ripple under the Djinn's rage. But they had escaped, for now. As they stumbled away from the collapsing ruins, Marcus's heart felt heavy with loss. Thomas was gone, his body left behind in the wreckage. The Djinn had taken everything, but the worst was yet to come. The ruins crumbled behind them, collapsing into dust as the desert trembled beneath the weight of the Djinn's rage. Marcus, Robert, and the wounded Muslim leader staggered away, their feet sinking into the sand, their bodies bruised and battered. But the Djinn's presence hadn't left. It hovered in the air above them, swirling like a living storm, its fiery eyes glaring down at the survivors as if mocking their futile escape. The night air was thick with dread. The stars, once bright and clear, had vanished, replaced by an unnatural darkness that pressed down on them like a suffocating shroud. The wind howled, carrying the Djinn's whispers, taunting them with every step. "We can't outrun it," Robert panted, his hand clutching his injured wrist. His eyes darted around, wild with fear. "It's still here. It's still coming." Marcus gritted his teeth, the weight of Thomas's death heavy on his heart. His legs ached, his body screamed for rest, but they had no choice but to keep moving. The Djinn was playing with them, like a cat toying with its prey. The Muslim leader, limping beside them, muttered prayers under his breath, his eyes locked on the swirling mass of smoke and fire that followed them, relentless and unyielding. "Where do we go?" Robert shouted over the wind. "We're running in circles." "There's nowhere to go," the leader rasped, his voice broken. "No place the Djinn cannot follow." A cold pit formed in Marcus's stomach. The leader was right. The desert belonged to the Djinn. It had always belonged to it. There was no escape, no sanctuary. The wards of the ruins had barely held it back, and now those were gone, buried under the sands. The only thing they could do was keep moving, delaying the inevitable. But how much longer could they run? Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted. Sand cascading like water, opening into a sinkhole. The earth seemed to swallow itself, and before any of them could react, Robert screamed as he lost his footing, tumbling into the dark pit below. "Robert!" Marcus cried out, lunging forward, but the sand gave way beneath him too. His body plunged downward, sand engulfing him, choking him as he fell into the darkness. The fall seemed endless, a suffocating descent into the belly of the earth, until Marcus hit the bottom with a painful thud. His limbs ached, his lungs burned, but he forced himself to his feet, coughing up dust and sand. He found Robert nearby, gasping and trying to dig himself out of the sand. "Are you alive?" Marcus wheezed, scrambling to his side. Robert spat out dirt, wincing in pain. "Barely." The Muslim leader fell beside them, his body limp, his breathing shallow. Marcus pulled him up, though the man seemed barely conscious, muttering prayers with what little energy he had left. Above them, the Djinn's laughter echoed through the pit. It hovered above the opening, looking down on them like a vengeful god. The sand swirled, twisting into unnatural patterns, as if the Djinn was controlling even the desert itself. "There is no escape," the Djinn's voice boomed, dark and cold. "You will die here, like all who came before you." Marcus stood, his sword trembling in his hand. His eyes were wild, desperate, but deep down, he knew the truth. There was no fighting this thing. He had killed Thomas, lost most of his men, and now they were trapped in a literal hole in the ground. The Djinn had won. But still, Marcus raised his sword, defiant. "We will fight you." The Djinn's laughter intensified, filling the pit with its sickening sound. "Fight me?" it sneered. "You cannot even save yourselves." The swirling sand shifted again, and suddenly Robert screamed. Marcus whipped around to see him sinking, his legs swallowed by the sand as if the earth itself was pulling him down. "Marcus, help!" Robert cried, clawing at the ground, his face contorted with terror. Marcus rushed to him, grabbing Robert's hand, pulling with all his strength, but it was no use. The sand was pulling Robert deeper, inch by inch. His body was being consumed, dragged into the earth. "I can't hold on." Marcus grunted, his muscles straining as he tried to pull Robert free. But Robert's face twisted with pain. "It's no use. It's got me." "No!" Marcus screamed, pulling harder, but the sand was too strong. It clung to Robert like 1,000 invisible hands, pulling him deeper, burying him alive. Robert's eyes met Marcus's for the last time, a flicker of resignation in them. "Go," he whispered. "Go while you still can." And then, with one final terrifying scream, Robert disappeared beneath the sand, swallowed whole by the desert. Marcus fell back, gasping for breath, his heart hammering in his chest. His hand shook, still feeling the weight of Robert's grip as the man had been torn from his grasp. He stared at the spot where Robert had been moments ago, now nothing more than a patch of disturbed sand, gone. The Djinn's voice echoed around them, mocking. "One by one, you all fall." Marcus clenched his fists, rage and despair battling inside him. There was nothing left. No men, no hope. Only the Djinn. Beside him, the Muslim leader let out a final, broken sigh. His body went limp, the injuries and exhaustion finally claiming him. Marcus was alone. The Djinn's form swirled above him, watching, waiting. "You are the last." Marcus looked up at it, his body trembling, his sword feeling like a useless piece of metal in his hands. He had failed. He had lost everything. But there was one thing left he could control, his own end. "I won't give you the satisfaction," Marcus spat, raising his sword toward his own chest. But the Djinn moved faster. Smoke shot down from above, wrapping around Marcus's wrists, yanking the sword from his grasp and sending it clattering to the ground. "You will not die on your terms," the Djinn hissed. "You will die on mine." The tendrils of smoke tightened around Marcus, lifting him off the ground. He gasped for breath as the Djinn's power crushed his chest, squeezing the life out of him. His vision blurred, the world turning dark. As his consciousness faded, Marcus's last thought was of Thomas, of the boy he couldn't save, of the army he had failed, of the desert that would claim him forever. And then, there was nothing but darkness. The desert lay still. The winds had calmed, and the swirling sandstorms of the night had faded. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the vast, empty dunes. All was quiet, save for the faint crunch of footsteps moving slowly through the sand. A lone figure walked, his body thin and hunched, his armor dented and covered in dust. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if every movement was weighed down by the heavy burden of exhaustion. His eyes, once bright with youth, were now hollow, empty. It was Thomas, but it wasn't Thomas. The boy's body moved like a puppet, its strings controlled by an unseen master. His face, once filled with innocence and fear, was now frozen in an expression of eerie calm. His lips curled into a faint smile, a smile that didn't belong to him. His eyes, flickering with an unnatural red glow, betrayed the truth of what he had become. The Djinn had won. For miles, the desert stretched out before him, silent and vast. But in the distance, the faint sound of hooves echoed on the horizon. A group of riders, Crusaders, appeared, their forms growing larger as they rode closer, their armor shining in the early morning light. Thomas's, or rather the Djinn's, smile widened. The Crusaders saw him, a lone survivor in the desolate expanse of the desert. One of the riders raised his hand, signaling the others to slow as they approached. They rode toward Thomas, their faces curious, concerned. "Is it one of ours?" One of the Crusaders called out as they neared. Another squinted, leaning forward in his saddle. "Looks like a squire. He must be the last one left from the expedition." The leader of the group slowed his horse to a stop a few yards away from Thomas. His eyes narrowed as he studied the boy. "You there! What's your name? Where's your unit?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Thomas raised his hand and waved. The gesture was slow, almost mechanical, but the Crusaders took it as a sign of relief. An ally who had somehow survived the perils of the desert. They spurred their horses forward, closing the distance between them and the boy. As they drew closer, the leader dismounted, walking toward Thomas with a smile. "You're safe now, boy. We'll get you out of here." But as he reached out to grasp the boy's shoulder, something flickered in Thomas's eyes. The faint red glow pulsed, just for a second, but it was enough. The leader hesitated, his hand freezing just inches from the boy's armor. His brow furrowed, a creeping sense of unease settling in the pit of his stomach. "Are you all right?" the leader asked, his voice cautious. Thomas's smile grew wider, almost too wide, stretching across his face in a way that no human smile should. His lips parted, revealing teeth stained with dried blood. His eyes, once the innocent blue of a young squire, were now burning red, filled with the Djinn's ancient, insatiable hunger. The leader took a step back, his hand moving instinctively to his sword. What in God's name? But it was too late. Thomas, no, the Djinn, lunged forward, his movements fast and unnatural. In the blink of an eye, he was upon the leader, his hands gripping the man's throat with an inhuman strength. The leader gasped, his eyes wide with shock, as the Djinn's power surged through the boy's body. The other Crusaders leaped from their horses, drawing their weapons, but none of them had time to react. The Djinn inside Thomas moved with blinding speed, twisting and snapping the leader's neck with a sickening crack. The body fell to the sand, lifeless. The remaining Crusaders froze in horror, staring at the thing that had once been a boy. But the Djinn only smiled, turning toward them with eyes that burned like the fires of hell. "We are just beginning." The Djinn's voice rasped from Thomas's throat, low and cold. The Crusaders, gripped by terror, turned to flee, but they didn't stand a chance. The Djinn moved faster than their eyes could follow, a blur of motion and death. The sound of bones breaking, armor shattering, and screams filled the morning air. In moments, the sand was soaked with blood. When the final Crusader fell, his body crumpling to the ground, the Djinn stood over the carnage, its work complete. It glanced down at Thomas's hands, now stained with the blood of his comrades, and smiled again. The desert was silent once more. The Djinn, still wrapped in the boy's skin, turned its gaze toward the horizon. There were more souls out there. More Crusaders, more warriors. More men who would fall under its control, just as Thomas had. And as the Djinn walked away from the carnage, heading deeper into the desert, it knew one thing for certain. It was only a matter of time. The hunt would never end. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.